I'm Sarah Mitchell, 32, a pediatric nurse from Denver who believed in fairy tale endings. At 9 months pregnant with our first child, I thought I was living mine. The nursery was painted soft yellow, the crib assembled, and my husband of 5. Years David seemed as excited as I was about becoming parents. But on that rainy Tuesday morning, everything I thought I knew about my life shattered in the span of 3 minutes. David walked into our kitchen with his lawyer sharp-suited woman I'd never seen before and divorce papers that had apparently been in preparation for months. As I stood there, swollen and vulnerable, clutching my morning tea, he calmly explained that he'd fallen in love with someone else, someone younger, without stretch marks or swollen ankles, someone who could give him the life he actually wanted. The contractions started as his lawyer was explaining custody arrangements. My water broke all over her $1,000 briefcase. What happened next would expose a web of lies that went deeper than I ever imagined and lead to the most satisfying justice I never saw coming. The ride to Denver General felt like a blur of pain and disbelief. David sat rigidly in the passenger seat while I gripped the steering wheel through contractions, his phone buzzing constantly with what I assumed were messages from Jessica. The lawyer had stayed behind, probably trying to salvage her soaked briefcase and expensive shoes. Can you at least pretend to care? I gasped between contractions as we pulled into the emergency bay. David looked at me with something that might have been guilt, but it was fleeting. Sarah, this doesn't change anything. We can work out the details after what? After what? After I give birth to our daughter alone while you plan your new life? The hospital bracelet they snapped around my wrist felt like a shackle patient. Sarah Mitchell, emergency labor and delivery. I'd worn hundreds of these during my nursing shifts, but never imagined I'd be the one wheeled through these corridors as my marriage crumbled. My colleague, Maria from the pediatric unit, happened to be working and rushed over when she saw me. Sarah, honey, what's happening? My water broke, I managed, deliberately not mentioning the divorce papers or David's betrayal. Some humiliations were too fresh to share, even with friends, but Maria's experienced eyes took in David's distracted demeanor, his phone calls in the corner while I labored, his obvious discomfort with the entire situation. She squeezed my hand. You're going to be fine. We'll take care of you. The contractions were coming faster now, and Dr. Peterson, whom I'd worked with for years, appeared at my bedside. Sarah, we need to get you upstairs. The baby's heart rate is dropping. As they wheeled me toward the elevator, I caught a glimpse of David still on his phone in the waiting area. Even now, even as his daughter was being born, he was somewhere else entirely. The woman I'd been 6 hours ago might have begged him to stay, to be present, to remember that this was supposed to be the most important day of our lives, but that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some betrayals are so complete. They burn away everything you thought you knew about love. Emma. Sarah Mitchell entered the world at 3:47 p.m., screaming imperfect, while her father missed her first breath because he was arranging his new life via text message. 3 days home from the hospital, Emma finally sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee and our laptop. David had taken what he called a few days to think and gone to stay with his brother, leaving me alone with our newborn and a stack of bills I'd never seen before. The first shock came when I logged into our joint checking account. The balance showed $347. $347. Our account that typically held at least $8,000 was nearly empty. My maternity leave pay wouldn't start for another week, and I had no idea how I was going to buy diapers, let alone pay the mortgage. My hands shook as I scrolled through months of transactions, large transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Cash withdrawals of $500, $800, sometimes $1,200 at a time. Restaurant charges at places David claimed he'd never been. Hotel rooms in downtown Denver on nights he said he was working late. The mortgage payment was 3 months behind. 3 months. While I'd been growing our daughter, trusting that David was handling our finances like he always had. He had been systematically draining our life savings to fund his double life. I found credit card statements hidden in his desk. Drawer cards I'd never seen before, all in his name, but tied to our joint credit history. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, weekend trips to Aspen. The itemized receipts painted a picture of a man courting a woman who expected to be impressed. With expensive gestures, Emma stirred in her bassinet, and I reached over to stroke her tiny hand. "It's okay, baby girl," I whispered. "Mommy's going to figure this out." But as I stared at the bank statement spread across the table, I realized this wasn't just about an affair. This was premeditated financial sabotage. David hadn't just fallen in love with someone else. He'd been planning his exit strategy for months, ensuring that when he left, I'd be too broke and overwhelmed to fight back. The laptop screen showed one more transaction that made my stomach drop. A $50,000 transfer to an account labeled D. Mitchell Holdings had been made just 2 weeks ago, while I was on bed rest. David had moved half of our savings to an account I'd never heard of. Right before serving me divorce papers, I reached for my phone and dialed the number I'd been avoiding. "Hi, Mom, it's Sarah. I need help. Jessica Martinez, 24 years old, marketing assistant at a tech startup." With the kind of effortless beauty that made other women feel invisible. I found her Instagram account within minutes of searching. David's phone records for the number that appeared most frequently during my pregnancy. Her profile was public, of course. Why wouldn't it be? She had nothing to hide, no reputation to protect, no marriage to preserve. Photo after photo showed her life of carefully curated perfection brunch at expensive restaurants. Weekend trips to mountain resorts, designer handbags. That cost more than my monthly grocery budget, but it was the timestamps that made my blood run cold. 8 months ago, while I was battling morning sickness and David was supposedly working overtime to save for the baby, he'd been at a wine festival in Napa with Jessica. 7 months ago, during my second trimester ultrasound that he'd missed. Because of an emergency at work, he'd been at a concert with her in Red Rocks. The photos told the story of a relationship that had been growing while mine was dying. Jessica's smile grew more confident with each post. Her outfits became more expensive, the restaurants more exclusive. And David, my husband, the father of my newborn daughter, appeared in the background of more and more photos as the months progressed. I screenshotted everything. Each dinner date, each weekend getaway, each expensive gift that I now realized had been purchased with money from our joint account. The evidence was overwhelming and damning, but what hurt most was how happy he looked in 5 years of marriage. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen David smile the way he smiled at Jessica Martinez. There was a video from just 3 weeks ago while I was on bed rest, worried about early labor, showing Jessica trying on what looked like an engagement ring at a jewelry store. David's voice could be heard in the background, telling her how beautiful she looked. An engagement ring. While his wife was home, swollen and exhausted, preparing to give birth to his child. He was ring shopping with his girlfriend. Emma started crying from her bassinet, and I closed the laptop with shaking hands. As I lifted my daughter to feed her, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. Unwashed hair, milk-stained pajamas, dark circles under my eyes. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who'd been abandoned at her most vulnerable moment by someone who'd promised to love her forever. But as I settled into the rocking chair with Emma, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't about being prettier or younger or more interesting than Jessica Martinez. This was about David being the kind of man who could look at his pregnant wife and decide she was disposable. Jessica Martinez was welcome to him, but she wasn't. Welcome to my daughter's college fund, my grandmother's jewelry, or the life I built before David decided to tear it down. I had work to do. The call came at 2 a.m., Emma's feeding time. David's mother, Patricia, had always been polite but distant, the kind of woman who believed her son could do no wrong and that I'd somehow trapped him into marriage by getting pregnant. Her voice was slurred with wine and something that sounded like guilt. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about David and that girl." I shifted Emma to my other arm, my heart pounding. "Patricia, are you drunk?" "Maybe, but I can't live with this anymore." I knew. I knew about her for months, and I encouraged it. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother-in-law, the woman who'd helped plan our wedding, who'd been at every family dinner for 5 years, who'd thrown my baby shower just 2 months ago, had known about the affair and encouraged it. "What are you talking about?" "She's pregnant. Sarah, that girl is pregnant, and David thinks he's going to marry her and start over. But you need to know something about the insurance." My blood turned to ice. "What insurance?" "The life insurance policy. David increased it 6 months ago. $2 million. He made me witness the paperwork, said it was for the baby's future, but Sarah, her voice broke. The way he talked about you, like you were already gone, like you were just an obstacle to his real life." I sank into the rocking chair, Emma still nursing peacefully, unaware that her grandmother was revealing the depth of her father's betrayal. "Patricia, are you saying you think David?" "I'm saying I got scared. The way he talked about how much easier his life would be without you, how Jessica deserved better than being someone's mistress. And then when you had complications during pregnancy, he seemed almost hopeful." The room spun around me. David's strange behavior during my difficult pregnancy suddenly made sense. His reluctance to take me to doctor's appointments. His insistence that I rest more, drive less, avoid stress. His suggestion that I go off my anxiety medication because it might not be safe for the baby. He's been planning this for months, hasn't he? Longer. The girl's family has money, Sarah. Real money. Her father owns half of downtown Denver, and David sees an opportunity. He always said you were too small town for his ambitions. Too small town. I'd supported him through graduate school, worked double shifts to pay for his business clothes and networking events, believed in his dreams even when they seemed impossible. I'd been his partner, his cheerleader, his soft place to land after. Difficult days dot, and he'd seen me as small town. "Patricia, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I held my granddaughter yesterday, and I realized what I'd helped him do. Emma deserves better than this. You both do. And Sarah, be careful. David's desperate now. The girl's family is starting to ask questions about his marriage status, and he needs this divorce to go through quickly and quietly." After I hung up, I sat in the dark holding Emma, processing what I'd learned. David hadn't just had an affair, he'd systematically planned to replace me with someone who fit his upgraded vision of success, and his own mother had helped him do it. I looked down at Emma's peaceful face, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine. My daughter would never know a world where her father was a man who abandoned his family for financial gain. But she would grow up knowing that her mother was strong enough to protect them both. The insurance papers were in David's desk drawer, exactly where Patricia said they'd be. $2 million, with Jessica Martinez listed as the secondary beneficiary after Emma. I photographed everything. David's lawyer called on a Thursday morning while I was changing Emma's diaper. The same woman whose briefcase had been soaked by my water breaking now spoke with the cold professionalism of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm calling about the prenuptial agreement. We'll need you to sign the acknowledgement forms by Friday." I paused, Emma's tiny legs kicking in the air. "What prenuptial agreement?" "The agreement you and David signed before your marriage." It clearly states that in the event of divorce, you waive rights to spousal support and agree to a 60 to 40 split of assets in David's favor. I never signed a prenuptial agreement. A pause. Mrs. Mitchell, we have your signature on file. Perhaps you've forgotten I'm a nurse, not an idiot. I remember signing away my rights to my own marriage. I want to see this document. The agreement arrived by courier that afternoon, and I stared at it in disbelief. My name, my signature, my supposed agreement to give up any claim to the life I'd helped build. But the signature was wrong. Close, but not quite right. The way. The is curved in Sarah, the loop of them in Mitchell, it was good. But it wasn't mine. I called the number my sister had given me for Rebecca Chen, a divorce attorney who'd helped a friend through a similar situation. Rebecca's office was in a sleek downtown building, the kind of place that intimidated me 6 months ago, but now felt like exactly where I needed to be. This is fraud, Rebecca said after examining the documents. And not very good fraud. We can prove this signature isn't yours with a simple handwriting analysis, but why would they risk it? David's lawyer has to know this won't hold up in court. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Because they're betting you won't fight it? They're counting on you being too overwhelmed, too broke, and too emotionally destroyed to challenge them. It's a bullying tactic. I thought about the woman I'd been just a week ago, exhausted, betrayed, financially desperate. They weren't wrong to bet on my compliance. But they'd underestimated what motherhood had awakened in me. What do? We document everything. Every forged signature, every hidden asset, every lie they've told. And then we take them apart piece by piece. Rebecca's retainer was $5,000 money I didn't have. But my mother had insisted on helping, and my sister had set up a crowdfunding page that had raised another $3,000 from friends, colleagues, and complete strangers who'd heard my story. One more thing, Rebecca said as I was leaving. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? When men like David start losing control, they can become unpredictable. I hadn't considered that I might be in danger. David had never been violent, never even raised his voice. But then again, I'd never seen him cornered before. That evening, I packed a bag for Emma and myself and drove to my sister's house across town. As I was loading the car, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street that I didn't recognize. When I pulled out of the driveway, it followed me for 3 blocks before turning off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was seeing threats that weren't there. But as I buckled Emma into her car seat, I realized I no longer trusted my own judgment about what David was capable of. The man who could forge his wife's signature and plan to profit from her death was a stranger to me. I needed to be smarter, more careful, more strategic than I'd ever been in my life. Emma's future depended on it. My nursing license hung in a simple black frame on my sister's guest room wall, where I'd moved it along with Emma's bassinet and the growing stack of legal documents that had become my new reality. The certification looked so official, so permanent, a reminder of the woman I'd been before David's betrayal tried to erase her. You're stronger than you think, my sister Lisa said, watching me study the license while Emma slept. You've been saving lives since you were 22. This is just another kind of emergency. She was right. At Denver General, I learned to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly when chaos erupted around me, to make life or death decisions without second-guessing myself. Those skills hadn't disappeared just because my personal life had imploded. Next morning, I walked into the pediatric unit for the first time since Emma's birth. My colleagues surrounded me with the kind of support that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession. These were people who understood crisis, who knew that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply show up. We've got your back, said Dr. Martinez, the attending who'd mentored me through my first year. And we've got some information that might help. It turned out that several of my colleagues had witnessed David's behavior during my pregnancy, his constant phone calls during my appointments, his obvious discomfort when anyone discussed the baby, his absence from the hospital classes I'd attended alone. He asked me about your schedule once, revealed Janet, the charge nurse, specifically when you work nights and when you'd be home alone. At the time, I thought he was being a caring husband. Now it felt like surveillance. David had been tracking my movements, my routines, my vulnerabilities. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning, but my coworkers had also noticed other things. The expensive watch David had started wearing 6 months ago. The new car he'd claimed was a lease. Through work, the way he'd started dressing better, grooming more carefully, acting like a man who was trying to impress someone. We should have said something, Dr. Martinez said. But you seemed so happy about the baby. It's not your fault, I assured her. I was seeing what I wanted to see. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, pulled me aside before I left. Sarah, I want you to know about some resources. There's a support group for women going through divorce, and there are legal aid services if you need them, but there's also something else. She handed me a card for a private investigator named Michael Torres. He's worked with several of our nurses who've been in similar situations. He's good and he's affordable. I stared at the card, overwhelmed by the kindness of people who barely knew me but were willing to help. In my marriage, I'd felt increasingly isolated, like David was the only person who truly understood me. Now I realized how wrong I'd been. That evening, I called Michael Torres. His voice was warm but professional, and he listened without judgment as I explained my situation. I can have preliminary findings within 48 hours, he said. But I need to ask, are you prepared for what I might find? I looked at Emma sleeping peacefully in her bouncer and thought about the woman I wanted her to see when she looked at her mother. Not a victim, not someone who accepted betrayal and moved on, but a woman who fought for what was right, who protected what mattered, who refused to let someone else's lies define her story. I'm prepared, I said. Find everything. The manila envelope from Michael Torres arrived on a rainy Friday morning, thick with documents that would change everything. I sat at Lisa's kitchen table with Emma in my lap, staring at the property deed that had David's signature dated just 3 months into my pregnancy. 1247 Maple Street, Denver, Colorado. A duplex in the trendy Reno district that I'd never seen, never heard of, never been told about. Purchase price, $485,000. Financing, cash down payment of $200,000 from our joint savings account, with the remaining balance mortgaged under David's name alone. He bought rental property while you were pregnant? Lisa asked, reading over my shoulder. It gets worse. I flipped through the documents. There are 2 more. A condo in Capitol Hill and a small apartment building in Lakewood. That's over $1 million in real estate purchased during our marriage with marital funds, all hidden from me. The rental income statement showed that David had been collecting nearly $8,000 a month from these properties, money that should have been improving our family's financial security, but instead had been funding his double life. Michael's investigation had uncovered a web of financial deception that went far deeper than I'd imagined. David had established a separate business entity, D. Mitchell Holdings, to manage the properties. He'd hired a property management company to handle day-to-day operations, ensuring I'd never accidentally encounter tenants or maintenance issues that might reveal his secret empire. But the most damning evidence was the pattern of transactions. Every month, David would transfer money from our joint account to fund property improvements, maintenance, and additional investments. He'd disguise these transfers as business expenses, consulting fees, and emergency repairs for our own home. Look at this. I showed Lisa a spreadsheet Michael had compiled. 3 years of systematic theft. He's been stealing from us to build his own portfolio. The phone rang, and I recognized Michael's number. Sarah, I've got more information, but you need to sit down for this. I was already sitting, but I braced myself anyway. Your husband's been liquidating assets all week. He sold the Lakewood property yesterday for $380,000 cash. The money went into an account that's not in his name. Whose name? Jessica Martinez's. Father, Roberto Martinez. It looks like David is trying to hide assets by transferring them to his girlfriend's family. My hands shook as I processed this information. David wasn't just leaving me. He was systematically stripping away everything we'd built together and giving it to the woman who'd helped him destroy our marriage. Michael, can we stop this? We can try. Your lawyer needs to file an emergency motion to freeze all assets immediately. But Sarah, there's something else. The condo in Capitol Hill. It's where David and Jessica have been living together for the past 4 months. Neighbors confirmed they've been presenting themselves as a married couple. 4 months? Well, I'd been on bed rest, worried about our baby's health. David had been playing house with Jessica Martinez in a home he bought with our money. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically sick. Emma stirred in my arms, and I kissed her forehead. It's okay, baby girl. Mommy's going to fix this. I called Rebecca Chen immediately. We need to file an emergency motion. Today, he's liquidating assets and hiding them with his girlfriend's family. I'll have papers ready within the hour. But Sarah, this is good news. This level of financial deception could result in him losing everything, including any chance at custody. As I hung up, I realized that David's greed might be the very thing that destroyed him. In trying to take everything, he'd left a trail of evidence that would expose his lies and ensure that Emma and I got justice. The property deed in my hands felt like a weapon now. David had always underestimated me, seen me as too trusting, too naive to fight back. But he'd forgotten that I was also too stubborn to give up. When someone I loved was threatened and Emma was worth fighting for. The medical records arrived in my email at 11:47 p.m., forwarded by Michael Torres with a note that simply read, "You need to see this immediately." Jessica Martinez, age 24, was 12 weeks pregnant. The ultrasound images were dated just 2 weeks ago, which meant she'd conceived around the same time Emma was born. While I was in the hospital recovering from childbirth, while David was pretending to be a concerned father, he was getting his girlfriend pregnant. I stared at the documents in disbelief. David wasn't just abandoning one family, he was creating another one. The engagement ring photos I'd found on Jessica's Instagram suddenly made perfect sense. He needed to marry her quickly, before her family discovered he was still married to someone else. But there was something else in the medical records that made my blood run cold. Jessica had listed David as the father, but she had also listed him as her emergency contact and financial guarantor. More disturbing, she'd indicated that this was her second pregnancy, with a note about a previous termination 6 months ago. 6 months ago. Right around the time I'd entered my second trimester and David had become increasingly distant and irritable. He'd been dealing with an unplanned pregnancy with his mistress while his wife was carrying his legitimate child. I called Michael immediately. Despite the late hour, "Did you know about the previous pregnancy?" "I found the records. Tonight, Sarah, there's more. Jessica's father isn't just wealthy, he's politically connected. Roberto Martinez sits on the city council and has significant influence in Denver's business community. David's been positioning himself to marry into that family for over a year. This was never about love," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. This was about upgrading his life. Jessica was never just the other woman, she was his business plan. It looks that way. But Sarah, there's something else you need to know. I've been watching David's activities since we started investigating, and he's been making some unusual purchases. Specifically, he's been buying pregnancy and baby supplies, a lot of them. The implications hit me like a physical blow. David was preparing to replace our daughter with Jessica's baby. He was going to play the role of devoted father to his new child while abandoning the one who'd already been born. Michael, I need you to find out everything you can about Jessica Martinez, her background, her family, her relationship with David before the affair started. I have a feeling this goes deeper than we know. The next morning, I was feeding Emma when my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a local area code. Sarah, this is Jessica Martinez. I think we need to talk. I nearly dropped the phone. Jessica, I know this is weird, but I found something in David's things that I think you should see. Can we meet somewhere public? I promise I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just think we've both been lied to. 2 hours later, I sat across from Jessica Martinez at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, Emma sleeping in her carrier beside me. Jessica was beautiful in person, but she looked tired, nervous, and younger than her Instagram photos suggested. I found these in David's laptop, she said, sliding a folder across the table. I was looking for insurance information because of the baby, and I found a folder labeled Sarah Project. The folder contained printed emails, bank statements, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of David's plan to divorce me. But the most shocking document was a handwritten note in David's writing that outlined his strategy. Wait until after baby is born to avoid additional complications. Transfer assets gradually. Establish relationship with Martinez family. Timing is crucial. Sarah must be vulnerable and dependent. Sarah Project, I repeated, staring at the papers. He made a plan to destroy my life. There's more, Jessica sighed quietly. I think I was part of this plan from the beginning. My father owns the building where David works, and they introduced us at a business dinner. David seemed so charming, so ambitious, but now I'm wondering if he researched my family before we even met. I looked at this young woman who'd unwittingly become part of David's scheme, and instead of the anger I'd expected to feel, I felt something like pity. Jessica, when did you find out he was married? 3 weeks ago. I saw your hospital bracelet in his car and confronted him. He said you were separated, that the marriage was over, that he was just waiting for the right time to make it official. The hospital bracelet? The one I'd been wearing when Emma was born. When my world fell apart, David had kept it like a trophy. Did you know about the life insurance policy? Jessica's face went pale. What life insurance policy? As I explained what David's mother had told me, I watched Jessica's expression change from confusion to horror. She was realizing, as I had, that David was capable of things neither of us had imagined. Sarah, I'm scared, she whispered. If he lied about this, what else has he lied about? Looking at her across the table, I realized that Jessica Martinez wasn't my enemy. She was another victim of David's manipulation, another woman who'd been used to further his ambitions. We need to work together, I said. Both of us have information he doesn't want revealed. Separately, we're vulnerable. Together, we might be able to stop him. The custody motion David filed was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as concern for Emma's welfare. According to his lawyer, I was an unstable new mother who was alienating the child from her father and creating a hostile environment that wasn't in Emma's best interests. His proposed parenting plan was laughably unrealistic. He wanted Emma every other weekend, alternating holidays, and 2 weeks during the summer once she was old enough to be away from me for extended periods. For a man who'd missed her birth, because he was on the phone with his mistress, who'd never changed a diaper or gotten up for a night feeding, who'd been planning to abandon us before she was even born. But the most audacious part of his filing was his claim that I was preventing him from seeing Emma. He'd submitted a detailed schedule showing all the times he'd requested visitation that I'd allegedly denied. The problem was I had text messages, proving that every single one of those requests had been made after Emma was already asleep, or during her feeding times, or when I was at doctor's appointments he'd known about in advance. This is a classic intimidation tactic, Rebecca explained as we prepared for the hearing. He's trying to make you look unreasonable while positioning himself as the concerned father. But his own documentation works against him. She was right. David's lawyer had included photos of the nursery he'd set up in the Capitol Hill condo, the one he'd been sharing with Jessica. But the nursery was clearly staged, with tags still on some of the baby items and no signs of actual use. More damning, there were no newborn-appropriate items. Everything was sized for a 6-month-old or older. He's not preparing for Emma, I realized. He's preparing for Jessica's baby. The hearing was held in a windowless room that smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. David sat with his new lawyer. He'd fired the woman whose briefcase I'd ruined, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He'd gotten a haircut and looked every inch the successful businessman who deserved to have his daughter on weekends. When the judge asked him to explain his relationship with Emma, David's performance was Oscar-worthy. He spoke about the deep bond he'd formed with his daughter, his commitment to being an involved father, his concern about my emotional stability affecting Emma's development. "Your Honor," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I just want to part of my daughter's life. I understand that Sarah is hurt about our marriage ending, but Emma deserves to know her father." Then it was my turn. Rebecca had coached me to stay calm, stick to facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. "Your Honor, I've brought documentation showing Mr. Mitchell's actual involvement in Emma's life." I handed over the hospital records showing his absence during labor, the text messages he'd sent during feeding times, the photos of him on his phone during our few supervised visits. I've also brought character witnesses who can speak to Mr. Mitchell's priorities during my pregnancy and since Emma's birth. Dr. Martinez took the stand first, describing David's behavior during my medical appointments. He was consistently distracted, often on his phone, and seemed more concerned with leaving quickly than with his wife's health or the baby's development. Maria from the pediatric unit testified about David's demeanor at the hospital. He was more focused on his phone calls than on his newborn daughter. When other fathers were learning to change diapers and feed their babies, Mr. Mitchell was in the hallway making business calls. But the most damaging testimony came from David's own mother. Patricia had agreed to testify truthfully about what she'd witnessed, and her words carried the weight of someone who'd wanted to believe in her son but couldn't ignore his actions. "David told me that having a baby would complicate his plans," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He saw Emma as an obstacle to the life he wanted with Jessica Martinez. He asked me to help him minimize his financial obligations to Sarah and the baby." The judge's expression shifted as he processed this information. "Mr. Mitchell, you asked your mother to help you minimize your obligations to your newborn daughter." David's composure cracked. "Your Honor, that's not my mother's confused. She's been drinking, and she's upset about the divorce, Mr. Mitchell." The judge interrupted. "I'm looking at bank records showing that you've been systematically hiding assets and transferring money to accounts controlled by your girlfriend's family. I'm also looking at evidence that you've been living with Miss Martinez in a property purchased with marital funds while your wife was pregnant. This doesn't paint a picture of a man who prioritizes his daughter's welfare." The judge's final ruling was everything I'd hoped for and more. David would get supervised visitation for 2 hours every Sunday, with no overnight stays until Emma was at least 2 years old. He would pay substantial child support, including daycare costs and health insurance. And most importantly, he was prohibited from having Jessica Martinez present during any visits with Emma. As we left the courthouse, David caught up with me in the parking lot. Gone was the charming facade he'd worn in the courtroom. This was the real David, angry, entitled, and dangerous. You think you've won something? He hissed. This isn't over, Sarah. Not by a long shot. I looked at him holding Emma's carrier, this man who'd once been the center of my world, and felt nothing but pity. No, David. For me, it's just beginning. The credit report that arrived in my email looked like a horror movie script. The accounts I'd never opened, credit cards I'd never signed for, loans I'd never taken out, all in my name, all maxed out, all destroying the financial reputation I'd spent years building. David had been busy during our marriage's final months, and identity theft was apparently just another item on his checklist of betrayal. 3 department store cards, 2 major credit cards, and a personal loan for $25,000, all opened using my social security number and forged signatures that were getting better with practice. This is criminal fraud, said Janet Morrison, the bank manager at Denver Community Credit Union, where I'd held accounts since college. She'd seen enough financial abuse cases to recognize the pattern immediately. We need to file police reports for each fraudulent account. Janet had been helping victims of financial abuse for 15 years, and she walked me through the process with the patience of someone who understood that this wasn't just about money, it was about power and control. He's trying to make you financially dependent, she explained as we filled out fraud affidavits. Men like your husband believe that if they can destroy your credit and drain your resources, you'll have no choice but to accept whatever they offer in the divorce. But David had made a crucial mistake. He'd been so focused on sabotaging my present that he'd forgotten about the foundation I'd built before our marriage. The credit union account I'd opened during nursing school, the small investment account I'd funded with overtime pay, the life insurance policy through the hospital. That predated our relationship. You're stronger financially than you think, Janet said as she helped me open new accounts that David couldn't access. And we're going to make sure you stay that way. The process of repairing the damage was exhausting. Phone calls to credit, card companies, affidavits for police reports, letters to credit bureaus disputing every fraudulent charge. But with each account I closed, each false charge I disputed, I felt like I was taking back pieces of myself that David had tried to steal. The most devastating discovery came when I received a notice from the IRS. David had filed our joint tax return for the previous year without my knowledge, claiming business losses that I'd never heard of and deductions that didn't exist. He'd used the return to justify a $15,000 refund that had gone directly into his private account. Tax fraud, Rebecca said when I showed her the documents. This keeps getting better and better. Every crime he commits strengthens our position in the divorce. But the emotional toll was crushing. I sat at Lisa's kitchen table every evening after Emma went to sleep, surrounded by papers and phone numbers, feeling like I was excavating the ruins of my own life. Every fraudulent account was evidence that the man I'd loved and trusted had seen me as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez mentioned that her husband was a forensic accountant who specialized in divorce cases involving hidden assets. Within a week, Paul Martinez had uncovered a financial trail that even Michael Torres had missed. Your husband is smarter than most, but he's not as smart as he thinks, Paul explained, showing me spreadsheets that tracked money through multiple accounts and business entities. He's been using a technique called artificial complexity, creating so many transactions and accounts that it's difficult to follow the money trail, but every transaction leaves a digital footprint. The footprints led to a revelation that took my breath away. David hadn't just been stealing from our marriage, he'd been embezzling from his employer. The business expenses he'd been claiming, the consulting fees he'd been paying himself, the emergency repairs that never happened, all of it was company money that he'd been funneling into his real estate investments. This is a federal crime, Paul said. Your husband has been using his position to steal from his company and using the proceeds to build a hidden empire. When this comes, Out, he's not just looking at divorce court, he's looking at prison. I thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib, unaware that her father was not just a cheater and a liar, but a criminal who'd been stealing from everyone around him. Part of me felt sad for the man David had once been, or the man I'd thought he was. But mostly, I felt relieved. The evidence was overwhelming now. David's pattern of fraud, theft, and deception painted a picture of someone who was fundamentally dishonest. Someone who saw other people as obstacles to his ambitions rather than human beings deserving of respect and honesty. What happens now? I asked Paul as he compiled his final report. Now we present everything to your lawyer, to the police, and to David's employer, and then we watch his house of cards collapse. As I drove home to Lisa's house that evening, I realized that David's greed had become the instrument of his own destruction. In trying to take everything, he'd left evidence of crimes that would cost him everything: his job, his freedom, his reputation, and any chance of being the kind of father Emma deserved. Justice, I was learning, didn't always come from the courtroom. Sometimes it came from a man's own arrogance and the meticulous record-keeping required to steal from everyone who trusted him. David requested the meeting through his lawyer, claiming he wanted to discuss Emma's future without the drama of court proceedings. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, the coffee shop where Jessica and I had first talked, public enough to be safe but private enough for him to reveal his true nature. He arrived 15 minutes late, wearing the expensive watch Jessica had posted about on Instagram and carrying himself with the confidence of a man who still believed he was in control. But I could see the cracks in his facade, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted around the room, the forced quality of his smile. "Sarah, you look good," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "Motherhood suits you." I didn't respond to the compliment. We were past pleasantries, past pretending that we had any relationship beyond the legal necessity of co-parenting Emma. "What do you want, David?" "I want to talk about our future." "Emma's future?" "I know you're angry about how things ended, but we can work this out without destroying each other." His phone buzzed on the table between us, and I caught a glimpse of Jessica's name on the screen. Even now, even during this conversation about our daughter's welfare, he couldn't focus entirely on what was supposed to matter most. "I've been thinking," he continued, "and I realize I made some mistakes. Maybe we moved too fast with the divorce. Maybe we should consider counseling, see if we can work things out for Emma's sake." The audacity was breathtaking. This man who'd been planning to leave me before our daughter was born, who'd stolen money from our accounts to fund his affair, who'd committed identity theft and embezzlement, was now suggesting we try couples therapy. "David, are you seriously suggesting that we get back together?" "I'm suggesting that we think about what's best for Emma. She needs both of her parents. Sarah, she needs stability, not this constant conflict between us." His phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at it longer. I could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to determine which approach would get him what he wanted. "Where's the money, David?" "What money?" "The money you transferred to Jessica's father's account. The money from the properties you sold without telling me. The money you embezzled from your company." His composure slipped for just a moment long, enough for me to see the panic beneath his practiced calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Paul Martinez is very thorough," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling through the forensic accountant's preliminary findings. "Did you know that every wire transfer leaves a digital trail? Every fake invoice, every forged signature, every penny you stole can be tracked back to you." David's face went pale. "Sarah, you don't understand the situation. I understand that you're a thief. I understand that you've been stealing from everyone who trusted you, me. Your employer, probably Jessica too, once she serves her purpose. You're being ridiculous. I made some business investments with stolen money, using forged documents. while lying to everyone involved about your marital status and financial obligations. His phone buzzed a third time, and he grabbed it with shaking hands. The text message was visible for a split second before he could hide it. "Where are you? My father wants to talk." "Jessica's father found out about us, didn't he?" I asked. "About Emma, about the fact that you're still married, about the money you've been hiding in his accounts." David's mask finally fell away completely. The charming businessman disappeared, replaced by someone desperate and cornered and dangerous. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're so smart with your lawyers and your investigators, but you're messing with people who have more power than you can imagine. Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality. Jessica's family has connections you can't compete with. They have lawyers who make yours look like public defenders. They have influence that reaches every courthouse in Denver. If you keep pushing this, you're going to lose everything." "I've already lost everything, David. You made sure of that when you decided that our marriage and our daughter were disposable." He leaned forward across the table, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and see the desperation in his eyes. "Sarah, be smart about this. Take the settlement offer, take the child support, take what I'm giving you and disappear. Or what? Or you'll find out what happens when you try to destroy a man who has nothing left to lose." I stood up from the table, feeling calmer than I had in months. David's threats felt empty now, the bluster of someone whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing around him. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I am going to destroy you, but not because I'm vindictive or angry. Because you're a criminal who abandoned his daughter, and criminals face consequences." As I walked away, I heard him calling my name, his voice cracking with something that might have been desperation or rage, but I didn't turn around. The woman who would have begged him to explain, who would have tried to find a way to forgive the unforgivable, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that some betrayals are so complete, they burn away everything you thought you knew about love, leaving only the clarity that comes from seeing someone's true nature. David was right about one thing. He was a man with nothing left to lose, but so was I. The call came at midnight, Jessica's voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her words. "Sarah, I need help. Can you meet me? David, something's wrong with David." I found her in the parking lot of an all-night diner in Aurora, sitting in her car with the engine running and her hands gripping the steering wheel like she was afraid to let go. When she rolled down the window, I could see she'd been crying for hours. "He knows that I talked to you," she said. "He came home tonight, and he was different, angry in a way I've never seen before." "Jessica, are you hurt?" "Not physically. But Sarah, I found something that changes everything." She handed me a small velvet box, the kind that expensive jewelry comes in. Inside was my grandmother's engagement ring, the one that had been in my family for 3 generations, the one David had claimed was lost during our move 2 years ago. "He gave this to me last week," Jessica whispered. "He said it was a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother. He proposed with. It said it represented our new beginning together." I stared at the ring, overwhelmed by rage and heartbreak in equal measure. My grandmother had given me this ring when I graduated nursing school, telling me to save it for someone who would love me the way my grandfather had loved her. David had stolen it from my jewelry box and given it to his mistress as a symbol of their love. "There's more," Jessica continued. "I confronted him about the ring after you told me about your grandmother. He said you'd given it to him before Emma was born, said you wanted him to have it as a reminder of your family. But Sarah, I found the insurance claim." She showed me a copy of the homeowner's insurance claim David had filed 18 months ago, listing my grandmother's ring as stolen during a break-in that had never happened. He'd collected $15,000 from the insurance company while keeping the ring to use as a proposal tool for his affair. Insurance fraud, I said, adding another crime to David's growing list. It gets worse. I started going through his things after I found the ring and I discovered these. Jessica pulled out a folder containing legal documents I'd never seen before. Powers of attorney that would give David control over my medical decisions. Life insurance beneficiary changes that I'd never signed. Financial documents that would transfer my nursing license and professional credentials to him in the event of my incapacitation. Jessica, these are plans for if something happened to you. Sarah, I think David was planning to. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to dot. My hands shook as I processed what she was showing me. David hadn't just been planning to divorce me, he'd been planning for my death. The increased life insurance, the medical powers of attorney, the systematic isolation from friends and family during my pregnancy. It hadn't been coincidence or the stress of impending fatherhood. It had been preparation. How long have you had these documents? I found them tonight. David went out to meet with my father about some business deal, and I was looking for our rental agreement when I found this whole folder hidden in his closet. I thought about David's strange behavior during my pregnancy, his insistence that I rest more, his suggestion that I stop driving, his recommendation that I switch to a doctor who was less experienced but more accommodating, his encouragement to stop taking my anxiety medication because it might not be safe for the baby, even though my doctor had assured me it was fine. Jessica, where is David now? That's what I'm trying to tell you. He's at my father's office and they're planning something. I heard him on the phone before he left, talking about permanent solutions and eliminating complications. Sarah, I think you're in danger. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. David's desperation during our coffee shop confrontation, his threats about people with power and influence, his claim that I was messing with forces I couldn't understand. He wasn't just trying to intimidate me, he was planning to silence me permanently. We need to call the police, I said. With what evidence? These documents could be explained as estate planning. The ring is just his word against yours. And my father, Jessica's voice broke. My father has half the police department in his pocket. Sarah, if David convinced him that you're a threat to the family's reputation, to their business interests, then we need to disappear. Both of us. Jessica stared at me in shock. What are you talking about? David's not just dangerous to me anymore. You know too much now. You've seen the documents. You know about the fraud. You understand what he's been planning. Do you really think he's going to let you walk away from this? The color drained from Jessica's face as she realized I was right. She'd gone from being David's accomplice to being a witness to his crimes. And witnesses to David's crimes had a way of becoming obstacles that needed to be eliminated. What do we do? I thought about Emma sleeping peacefully at Lisa's house, unaware that her father was a man who saw murder as a business decision. I thought about the life I'd built as a nurse, the friends who trusted me, the patients who depended on me. David was trying to take all of that away, not through divorce or legal maneuvering, but through something far more final. We fight back, I said, but we do it smart and we do it together. Jessica nodded, clutching the velvet box that contained my grandmother's ring. Two women who'd been pitted against each other by a man who saw them both as disposable, now united against someone who'd proven himself capable of anything. David had taught Zeus both a valuable lesson about trust and betrayal. Now it was time to teach him one about the consequences of underestimating the women he'd tried to destroy. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver had never felt more imposing than it did on the morning of David's emergency hearing. Jessica and I had spent 3 days documenting everything, every forged signature, every fraudulent document. The FBI had taken our evidence seriously enough to arrest David at his office, and now we were watching justice unfold in real time. Judge Patricia Hendricks had a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime, and her expression as she reviewed the evidence suggested that David had picked the wrong judge to impress with his charm. Rebecca sat beside me, a stack of documents 3 inches thick in front of her. While David's new lawyer, his fourth since the divorce proceedings began, looked like he was reconsidering his career choices. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Hendricks began, her voice cutting through the courtroom's silence. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by the prosecution, and I must say, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of financial fraud I've seen in 20 years on the bench." David sat ramrod straight at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit that replaced his expensive suits. The confident businessman who'd threatened me in the coffee shop was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, diminished, exposed. "The court finds evidence of systematic embezzlement from your employer, identity theft involving your wife's financial accounts, insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes involving your co-conspirator, Roberto Martinez." Jessica gasped beside me. Her father had been arrested the morning after David, charged with money laundering and conspiracy. The Martinez family's political connections couldn't protect them from federal charges backed by ironclad evidence. Furthermore, the judge continued, "The court has reviewed the documents suggesting premeditation of harm against your wife, Sarah Mitchell. While these charges are still under investigation, they demonstrate a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond typical divorce proceedings." David's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence regarding any plans to harm his wife." The documents in question could be interpreted as estate planning. "Counselor," Judge Hendricks interrupted, "estate planning doesn't typically include research on untraceable toxins in life, insurance policies taken out without the beneficiary's knowledge." "Sit down." The judge's ruling was everything I'd hoped for and more. David's assets were frozen, pending restitution to his victims. His passport was confiscated, and he was remanded to federal custody without bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. But the most satisfying moment came when the judge addressed the divorce proceedings directly. "Mr. Mitchell, you are hereby ordered to pay immediate restitution to your wife in the amount of $485,000, representing the marital assets you fraudulently transferred. You will pay child support in the amount of $3,200 per month, plus all medical and educational expenses for your daughter. Your parental rights are suspended pending a full psychological evaluation and completion of your criminal sentence." David turned to look at me then, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. This wasn't how his story was supposed to end. He was supposed to be starting his new life with Jessica and her family's money, not sitting in federal prison wondering how his carefully laid plans had crumbled so completely. Additionally, the judge continued, "Given the evidence of financial abuse and potential domestic violence, this court is issuing a permanent restraining order protecting Sarah Mitchell and her daughter from any contact with the defendant." The bailiff led David away in handcuffs. He mouthed words at me that I couldn't hear but didn't need to. His threats were meaningless now. The man who once held my entire future in his hands was being led away to face the consequences of his own choices. Jessica was crying beside me, whether from relief or grief I couldn't tell. Her world had imploded just as thoroughly as mine had, but at least we'd survived the blast. "It's over," Rebecca said, squeezing my hand. "He can't hurt you anymore." But as we left the courthouse, I realized it wasn't really over, it was just beginning. David was facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Jessica was cooperating with prosecutors to avoid charges related to the money laundering, and Emma and I were finally free to build the life we deserved. The crowd of reporters outside asked me how I felt about my husband's conviction, what I planned to do next, whether I felt vindicated by the judge's ruling. I thought about the woman I'd been 9 months ago, trusting and naive, believing that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. I feel grateful, I told them. Grateful that the truth came out. Grateful for the people who helped me fight for justice. And grateful that my daughter will grow up knowing that her mother never gave up on doing what was right. That evening, I sat in Lisa's living room holding Emma, watching the news coverage of David's sentencing. The man on the screen looked like a stranger, someone I'd write about in the paper rather than someone I'd once planned to spend my life. With Emma gurgled happily in my arms, unaware that her father would be in prison for most of her childhood, unaware of how close we'd both come to losing everything. She would grow up with questions about why her father wasn't around, and I would answer them honestly when she was old enough to understand. But tonight, she was just a perfect baby who smiled at her mother and fell asleep to the sound of my voice, reading her favorite story. Tonight, we were safe, and justice had been served, and the future stretched ahead of us full of possibilities that didn't include fear or betrayal or the constant anxiety of wondering when my other shoe would drop. David had taught me that some people are capable of unimaginable cruelty toward those who love them. But he'd also taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, capable of fighting battles I'd never wanted to fight and winning wars I'd never thought I could survive. The judge's ruling sat on the coffee table beside me, official proof that sometimes the good guys really do win. And sometimes justice isn't just a concept, but a living, breathing thing that protects the innocent and punishes those who prey on them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after David's sentencing. It was from Peterson and Associates, the accounting firm where David had worked for 7 years, written on official letterhead in the formal language of corporate damage. Control. Dear Mrs. Mitchell, it began, we are writing to inform you that your husband's employment with our firm has been terminated, effective immediately, due to gross misconduct and violation of fiduciary responsibilities. The letter went on to detail the scope of David's embezzlement, over $200,000 stolen from client accounts over 2 years, falsified expense reports totaling $50,000, and the use of company resources to fund his personal real estate investments. The firm was pursuing criminal charges and civil restitution, adding to the mountain of legal problems David faced from federal prison, but the most telling detail was in the final paragraph. Please be advised that Mr. Mitchell's professional certifications have been revoked by the Colorado State Board of Accountancy. He will be permanently barred from practicing public accounting in any capacity. David's career was over. The ambition that had driven him to betray everyone who trusted him had ultimately destroyed the very success he'd been trying to protect. Jessica called me that afternoon with news that her family's situation was equally dire. My father's been suspended from the city council pending investigation, she said, her voice hollow. The FBI seized all of his business accounts, and our lawyer says the money laundering charges are just the beginning. Roberto Martinez's empire was crumbling under federal scrutiny. The real estate deals, the political connections, the influence. That David had been so eager to join all of it was built on a foundation of corruption that couldn't withstand the light of investigation. What about you? I asked. I'm cooperating with the prosecutors. They've offered me immunity in exchange for testimony about David's schemes and my father's involvement. But Sarah, her voice broke. I'm pregnant and alone, and everyone I trusted has either been arrested or revealed themselves to be criminals. I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing her distress. 6 months ago, Jessica Martinez had been the woman who was stealing my husband and destroying my marriage. Now she was a fellow victim of David's manipulation, facing single motherhood under circumstances even more difficult than mine. Have you thought about what you'll do when the baby comes? I don't know. My family's assets are frozen, David's in prison, and I'm living off savings that won't last much longer. I've been thinking about moving back to California, starting over somewhere no one knows my name. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had promised Jessica a life of wealth and privilege, painted pictures of a future where her family's money and his ambition would create something powerful and lasting. Instead, he destroyed her family's reputation, sent her father to prison, and left her facing the same single motherhood he'd tried to escape by abandoning Emma and me. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Torres, the private investigator who'd helped uncover David's crimes. Check the news. Channel 7 is running a story about Martinez construction. I turned on the television to find a reporter standing outside the Denver offices of Roberto Martinez's construction company, explaining how federal investigators had uncovered a decade-long pattern of bid rigging, tax evasion, and political bribery. The scandal was expanding beyond David's embezzlement, revealing a network of corruption that reached into city government, construction contracts, and real estate development. Sources close to the investigation tell Channel 7 that Roberto Martinez may have used his position on the city council to steer municipal contracts to his own companies, the reporter was saying. The FBI estimates that fraudulent practices may have cost Denver taxpayers more than $10 million over the past 5 years. David had thought he was marrying into power and influence. Instead, he had attached himself to a criminal enterprise that was always one investigation away from complete collapse. His greed and ambition had led him straight into a federal conspiracy that would keep him in prison well into his 50s. The next morning brought a resignation letter from David's lawyer, his fifth since the proceedings began. No one wanted to be associated with a case that was generating this much negative publicity and federal attention. David was running out of people willing to help him, running out of money to pay for help, running out of options for avoiding the consequences of his choices. That evening, I received a call from the Federal Detention Center. David's voice was different, smaller, defeated, stripped of the confidence that had once made him so magnetic. "Sarah, I need you to know, I never meant for things to go this far. David, you planned my murder. That's about as far as things can go." The documents weren't. I wasn't actually going to. He couldn't finish the sentence because we both knew it was a lie. "What do you want?" "I want you to bring Emma to see me. I want to explain to her that I'm not the monster everyone says I am. Emma is 8 months old, David. She doesn't understand monsters or angels. She just knows that her father isn't here. Please, Sarah, I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes of forgetting anniversaries or leaving dishes in the sink. What you did was criminal. What you did was evil." The line was quiet for a long moment. When David spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I loved you once. That has to count for something." "Maybe you did," I said. "But love isn't enough when someone chooses greed over everything else. Love isn't enough when someone sees their family as obstacles to their ambition." After I hung up, I sat holding Emma, thinking about the man David had been when met, and the man he'd become by the time our marriage ended. Somewhere along the way, he decided that what he wanted was more important than who he hurt to get it. The news was running another story about the Martinez scandal, showing Roberto Martinez being led away in handcuffs, his construction empire in ruins. David had destroyed his own life chasing after someone else's money, only to discover that the money was built on crimes that would ultimately destroy everyone involved. Emma laughed and reached for my face. Blissfully unaware of her father's downfall, she would grow up knowing that actions have consequences, that integrity matters more than ambition, and that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who betray us most completely. But she would also know that her mother had fought for justice and won. The house keys felt solid and real in my palm as the realtor handed them over with a smile that said she understood this was about more than just buying property. This was about reclamation, about building something that belonged entirely to Emmett and me. "Congratulations, Sarah. You're officially a homeowner." The house was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow in the Highlands neighborhood. with a small yard perfect for a toddler to explore and enough space for the life I was planning to build. I'd paid cash using the restitution money from David's conviction, ensuring that no bank could ever threaten to take it away. No hidden debts could surface to destroy our security. Emma took her first steps in the living room 3 days after we moved in, wobbling from the couch to my outstretched arms while I cried happy tears and fumbled for my phone to capture the moment. There was no one to call and share the milestone with except Lisa. No proud father to witness his daughter's achievement. But somehow that felt right. This was our beginning, uncontaminated by the lies and betrayals that had defined Emma's first year of life. "Mama," Emma said clearly for the first time that evening, standing in her new crib and grinning at me with 4 tiny teeth. I had been mama, daddy, provider, and protector for months, but hearing her say the word felt like official recognition of the role I'd been growing into since the day David walked out. Returning to work at Denver General felt like coming home. My colleagues had followed the news coverage of David's trial, and they welcomed me back with the kind of support that reminded me why I had chosen nursing in the first place. Dr. Martinez had arranged a flexible schedule that allowed me to work 3 12-hour shifts per week, giving me time with Emma while maintaining the career that had always been my anchor. "You look different," observed Janet, the charge nurse, during my first week back. "Stronger somehow." She was right. The woman who'd returned to work was not the same person who'd left on maternity leave 11 months ago. That woman had been defined by her relationships, her role as a wife, her belief that her worth was tied to someone else's assessment of her value. This woman knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of achieving. The daycare I'd chosen for Emma was run by a former nurse who understood the demands of hospital work. Emma thrived there, playing with other children and developing the social skills that would serve her well in a world where family might be smaller, but community could be larger. My evenings became a routine I'd never expected to love. Bath time, with Emma reading stories in the rocking chair I'd placed by her bedroom window, watching her fall asleep to the sound of my voice singing lullabies my grandmother had sung to me. There was peace in the predictability, comfort in knowing that no one could disrupt the sanctuary we'd created. The friendship that developed with my neighbor, Mrs. Chun, a widow who'd raised 4 children on her own, became an unexpected source of wisdom and support. She would watch Emma when I worked late shifts, and I helped her with grocery shopping and yard work that had become difficult as she aged. "Single motherhood isn't a tragedy," she told me one evening as we sat on her porch watching Emma play in the yard. "It's just a different kind of family. Sometimes a better kind." The first letter from another woman arrived 6 months after we'd settled into our new routine. She'd seen the news coverage of David's conviction and wanted advice about her own situation. A husband who was hiding assets, exhibiting controlling behavior, and showing signs that their marriage was heading toward a similar crisis. I spent 3 hours on the phone with her, sharing the lessons I'd learned about documenting financial abuse, building a support network, and recognizing the signs of escalating danger. By the end of our conversation, she had a plan for protecting herself and her children. More letters followed. Women who recognized their own stories in mine, who were looking for guidance on navigating divorce from manipulative partners, who needed someone to tell them that they were strong enough to fight back and smart enough to win. I started a blog called Surviving Betrayal, sharing practical advice about financial protection, legal resources, and emotional healing. The response was overwhelming, hundreds of women writing to say they'd found hope in my story, courage in my example, strength in knowing they weren't alone. "You're helping people," Rebecca said when I showed her some of the messages I'd received. "You're turning your trauma into purpose." She was right. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. I'd learned to be my own advocate, my own protector, my own source of validation. And now I could teach other women to do the same. Emma's First birthday party was small but perfect. Lisa and her family. My coworkers from the hospital, Mrs. Chun, and a few neighbors who'd become friends. We celebrated in the backyard of our little house, Emma smearing chocolate cake on her face while the adults laughed and took pictures. There was no father figure cutting the cake or making speeches about his daughter's future. But there was a mother who'd fought for the right to give her child a life free from lies and manipulation. There was a community of people who'd chosen to be part of Emma's story, not because they had to, but because they wanted to dot as I watched Emma play with her new toys. Surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her welfare, I realized that David's absence wasn't a loss to be grieved, it was a gift to be cherished. Emma would grow up knowing only love that was honest, support that was unconditional, and security that couldn't be threatened by someone else's ambitions. The house keys in my pocket felt like more than just access to property. They represented freedom, independence, and the power to create a life that belonged entirely to us. The criminal court summons arrived on a gray February morning, 18 months after David's initial arrest. The federal prosecutors were finally ready to proceed with the attempted murder charges, and they needed me to testify about the documents. Jessica had found the insurance policies and David's escalating threats. Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos called to prepare me for what to expect. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand that your ex-husband has been offered multiple plea deals over the past year. He's rejected every one of them because he still believes he can convince a jury that he's the victim in this situation. David's continued denial wasn't surprising. Even from federal prison, he'd been sending letters to mutual acquaintances claiming that I'd manipulated the evidence, that Jessica had fabricated documents out of spite, that he was being railroaded by a system biased against successful men. What kind of sentence is he looking at if convicted? With the financial crimes, the conspiracy charges, and the attempted murder counts, he's facing life in prison. The fact that he's shown no remorse, no acceptance of responsibility, works against him significantly. The courtroom was packed for the trial. David's case had become a cautionary tale about white-collar crime and domestic abuse, drawing attention from legal professionals, victim advocates, and journalists covering the intersection of financial manipulation and violence against women. David looked older than his 34 years as he sat at the defendant's table. Prison had stripped away the polish that had once made him so appealing. The expensive clothes, the confident posture, the charming smile that had convinced so many people of his inherent goodness. In his place sat someone diminished, desperate, and still clinging to the delusion that he could talk his way out of the consequences of his actions. His new lawyer, a public defender who'd drawn the short straw, tried to paint him as a man who'd made poor choices but wasn't capable of murder. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, David Mitchell is guilty of financial crimes. He's guilty of betraying his wife's trust. But planning to kill someone? That's a completely different kind of person. The prosecutor's response was devastating in its simplicity. She walked the jury through the timeline, the life insurance increases, the medical powers of attorney, the research on untraceable poisons found on David's computer, the systematic isolation of his wife during her most vulnerable period. This wasn't a crime of passion, she explained. This was a business plan. David Mitchell saw his wife and daughter as obstacles to the life he wanted with Jessica Martinez and her family's money. He calculated that murder would be more profitable than divorce. When I took the stand, David stared at me with an intensity that would have terrified the woman I'd been 2 years ago. Now it felt like the desperate gaze of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. Mrs. Mitchell, the prosecutor asked, when you discovered the documents outlining your husband's plans, how did you feel? Betrayed, I said, looking directly at David, but not surprised. By that point, I'd learned that the man I married was capable of anything if it served his interests. David's lawyer tried to discredit my testimony, suggesting that I'd been emotionally unstable after giving birth, that I'd misinterpreted innocent estate planning documents as something sinister. But the evidence was overwhelming computer searches for undetectable poisons, making death look accidental, and life insurance investigation procedures. The most damaging testimony came from David's former cellmate, a man named Rodriguez who'd been released 6 months earlier and had no reason to lie. Mitchell talked about his wife constantly, Rodriguez testified. He was obsessed with the idea that she'd ruined his life by exposing his crimes. He talked about how he should have solved the problem permanently before she had a chance to hire lawyers. When David finally took the stand in his own defense, his performance was a masterclass in narcissistic self-pity. He claimed he'd been trapped in an unhappy marriage, that I'd been emotionally manipulative, that his affair with Jessica was the first happiness he'd experienced in years. "I never intended to hurt Sarah," he said, his voice breaking with what he probably thought was convincing emotion. The documents were just contingency planning. Any responsible husband would want to make sure his family was protected if something happened to him. "Mr. Mitchell," the prosecutor asked during cross-examination, "can you explain why contingency planning would include research on making death look accidental?" David's composure cracked. "I don't remember researching that. Maybe it was for a book I was thinking about writing, or a movie I'd seen. So you're saying you accidentally researched murder methods while coincidentally increasing your wife's life insurance and giving yourself power of attorney over her medical decisions?" The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, and racketeering in connection with the Martinez family's criminal enterprise. Judge Hendricks sentenced David to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "you betrayed everyone who trusted you, your wife, your daughter, your employer, and your community. You showed a complete lack of remorse and a willingness to destroy innocent lives for personal gain. This court finds that you pose a continuing danger to society." As the bailiff led David away for the final time, he turned to look at me one last time. There was no charm left, no manipulation, no attempt to win my sympathy. Just the cold stare of someone who blamed everyone except himself for the destruction he'd caused. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked me how I felt about the verdict. "I feel relieved," I said. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted justice. My daughter will grow up knowing that people who hurt others face consequences for their actions." That evening, I sat in Emma's room watching her sleep, thinking about the man who'd once been her father and the choice he'd made to prioritize his ambitions over his family's safety. Emma would grow up with questions about why her father wasn't in her life, and I would answer them honestly when she was old enough to understand, but she would also grow up knowing that her mother had been strong enough to protect them both, smart enough to uncover the truth, and brave enough to ensure that justice was served. David's consequences were finally complete. 25 years to life in federal prison, his professional reputation destroyed, his assets seized, his freedom forfeited. He'd gambled everything on a plan that required the destruction of everyone who'd ever loved him, and he'd lost everything. Emma's first birthday photo sits on my desk at Denver General, a constant reminder of how far we've both come in the 2 years since my water broke on a lawyer's briefcase and my world exploded into chaos. In the picture, she's grinning at the camera with chocolate cake smeared across her face, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from growing up surrounded by people who choose to love her. She turned 2 last month, and her birthday party was everything I dreamed of during those dark early days when I wondered if we'd survive David's betrayal. 23 people came to celebrate, friends from work, neighbors who'd become family, Lisa and her children, Mrs. Chen with a hand-knitted sweater she'd been working on for months. Emma ran around our backyard in a princess dress, completely unaware that her life had once hung in the balance of her father's ambitions. The letter that arrived this morning is from a woman named Angela in Phoenix, and it reminds me why I continue sharing our story despite the painful memories it sometimes brings up. Dear Sarah, it begins. I saw your interview on Channel 12 last week, and I knew I had to write. My husband has been hiding money, controlling my access to our accounts, and making threats about what will happen if I try to leave. Yesterday, I found life insurance policies I never signed for. I think I'm living your story in real time. I've received hundreds of letters like Angela's over the past year. Women who recognize the warning signs because I've taught them what to look for. Women who find the courage to document evidence because I've shown them how. Women who discover that they're stronger than they imagined because I've proven it's possible to fight back and win. The nonprofit organization I started 6 months ago, called Second Chances, has helped 37 women escape situations similar to mine. We provide legal resources, financial assistance, and emotional support for women dealing with financial abuse and domestic manipulation. The seed money came from my victim restitution fund, but the donations that keep us running come from people who believe that every woman deserves a chance to rebuild her life. Emma is napping in the daycare center downstairs while I finish my shift, completely content with her routine of mornings with me, afternoons with Miss Kelly and her friends, and evenings in our little house where she's learning to read and asking endless questions about everything she sees. Mama, where's my daddy? She asked last week, the question I'd been preparing for since she was born. Your daddy made some bad choices that hurt people, I told her, using the language the child psychologist had recommended. He's in a place where people go when they need to learn to make better choices, but you have lots of people who love you and take care of you. Like you and Aunt Lisa and Mrs. Chen, exactly like us. She nodded solemnly and went back to playing with her blocks, accepting the explanation with the resilience that seems to be her defining characteristic. She's never known a world where her father was present, so his absence doesn't feel like a loss to her. It's just the way things are. Jessica sends me updates occasionally. She moved to California after Roberto Martinez was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and she's raising her son, Miguel, as a single mother. We've become unlikely friends, bonded by our shared experience of surviving David's manipulation. Her son is 6 months younger than Emma, and sometimes I wonder if they'll ever meet. These half-siblings whose father saw them both as obstacles to his ambitions. The blog I started has grown into something larger than I ever imagined. Surviving Betrayal now has over 50,000 regular readers, and I've been invited to speak at conferences about financial abuse, domestic violence, and the intersection of white-collar crime and family destruction. My story has become a teaching, tool, a warning, and a source of hope for women who thought they were alone in their struggles. Dr. Martinez stopped by my station this afternoon with news that made my day. Sarah, I just got off the phone with the Colorado Nurses Association. They want to give you their Public Service Award for your work with Second Chances. Their recognition feels surreal. 2 years ago, I was a woman whose husband had convinced her she was small town and disposable. Now I'm being honored for using my trauma to help other women reclaim their power and rebuild their lives. Emma wakes up from her nap, chattering about the dinosaur book Miss Kelly read to her class. And we drive home through the Denver streets that once felt like a prison, but now feel like a neighborhood full of possibilities. Our house looks exactly like what it is, a home built by a mother who is determined to give her daughter the security and love that every child deserves. Tonight, like every night, I'll read Emma her favorite story, sing her the lullabies my grandmother sang to me, and tuck her into the bed in the room she's never had to share or lose or worry about someone taking away. She'd fall asleep knowing that tomorrow will bring more love, more safety, more of the predictable joy that children need to grow into confident, healthy adults. The woman I was before David's betrayal would be amazed by the life we've built. She would be proud of the strength I found, the battles I fought, the justice I demanded. But mostly, she would be grateful for the lesson that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for discovering who you really are. David destroyed the life I thought I wanted, but in doing so, he forced me to build the life I actually needed. He tried to erase my worth, but he ended up proving my strength. He attempted to leave me with nothing, but he taught me that I was capable of creating everything. Emma Sarah Mitchell will grow up knowing that her mother fought for her, protected her, and chose love over fear every single day. Shay know that justice is possible, that bad people face consequences, and that good people flawed, scared. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when someone they love is threatened. The photo on my desk shows a little girl who's never doubted that she's cherished, never questioned whether she's safe, never wondered if her mother will be there when she needs her. It shows the face of someone who will grow up understanding that family isn't defined by biology or legal documents, but by the people who choose to show up day after day with love that asks for nothing in return. That's the woman I became the space between my water breaking and my new life beginning. That's the mother Emma deserves and the person I was always meant to be.